I don't try this very often because I remember the occasion many Epiphanies ago when I decided to have some frankincense in the church, and two ladies, sisters, widowed, or had never married, in the front row dashed out and said, "They're trying to kill us." So I've never forgotten that some people have problems with incense. The baby Jesus apparently was unaware. And if you were in a stable, it was probably a better smell than the alternative. This is frankincense. Of the other ones, myrrh symbolically is anointing for burial. So this is presented in the probably a religious setting, divinity, symbolic of divinity, and that gold was the gift of kings. So those are the three, and I thought I would treat you at least with some frankincense, and perhaps you can open a window in the back now.
Smoke detector didn't work.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
When does the gold get handed out?
Yeah. There you go.
Today we talk about kings, three kings, wise men, sages, magi, your pick. I noted in the translation of the Bible in the pew today, which is Revised Standard Version, new Revised Standard Version, it's wise men from the east. We sang, however, about kings, and some have said sages. What's your preference? We don't know who they were. Guys who came from somewhere east of Bethlehem. We'll look a little bit later at a typical Epiphany custom of inscribing over the door of a household the three initials, which sometimes are referred to as kings. I once had the experience, my son and I were on a trip, and we were in Berlin, and we were staying at a nunnery. And I said to the nun, noticing over the door, that it was, I forgot what the year was, but typically, let's say 20 on one side, 10 on the other, so 2010, and then across, and then which would be first? In Latin, it would be benedicam casam, so bless this house. But Balthazar, Casper, and who's the third guy? Melchior. So she said, in one of the biggest put-downs I've ever had in my life, "Oh, sir," she said, "that's for the simple people." When you give them names, because every culture has different names for the wise men. And so in Latin, you can have them, and then in German and English, there are many different kinds of names that have been given to the wise men. But typically it means bless this house. And so the priest goes around on Epiphany and with chalk writes on the door. I'll show you a picture of it later. And it looks like he's saying Balthazar, Melchior, Casper, but he's really saying bless this house for the coming year. So 2025. It's a nice custom, and if a big congregation and the priest can get to all of the houses, that would be a big thing. I'd like to talk about these different aspects of Christmas and Epiphany. The problem with calendars, how we got to this mix-up, what Bethlehem was all about, what Epiphany is all about today in different denominations, and something about icons, and then something about popular celebrations for Epiphany. So any point you want to jump in and say, what's this all about, or I remember this from my experience from my youth, do that. I take you first back to the whole issue of calendars. So we had a Julian calendar and we had a Gregorian calendar. And the Julian calendar was established by Julius Caesar, and it operated from roughly 32 until 1584, I believe, 1583. And then Pope Gregory decided to make some changes because of confusions that existed, trying always to get the leap years and other things into the calendar. So the Gregorian calendar is what most of us operate in the Western world with today. There are still some church bodies, some ethnic groups, which operate with the Julian calendar, and that makes it all just a little bit confusing. How did we get to December 25th? How did we get to January 6th? Both of those dates represent similar things in different kinds of ethnic backgrounds. And changes took place at different times, so one might think that St. Constantine and St. Helena down the street from us, the Greek Orthodox Church, would be celebrating Christmas with us this weekend. However, the Greeks changed in 1923 and established Christmas as Gregorian calendar year, and so they celebrated the 25th with us, even though they're part of the Orthodox community, and much of the Orthodox community celebrates that on the 6th, and then even sometimes on the 19th. So it gets a little bit confusing. I'm going to use glasses to try to read what I've got on mine. Aha. Many people said that the winter solstice, the time when we change from fall to winter, is a time when Christmas came to be established on the 25th. And even that changes. One time my wife and I were in London on the 21st, and we thought, well, let's take a bus trip, something to do. And we took a bus trip to Salisbury and to Stonehenge. And when we got to Stonehenge, there were all these witches which were dancing around and playing horns and bagpipes and things. We thought, what's going on? They said, it's the winter solstice, and all the creepies come out of the woods. So I never really thought about what impact the ancient world might have on the modern world, except on that particular occasion. Some have said that Saturnalia, which was the Roman celebration for Saturn, which took place roughly on the 25th, and the Christians decided that they would make that day spiritual instead of having it be a pagan holiday, and therefore the 25th became the Christian holiday. That's a theory. Another theory is that in the book called the Didascalia Apostolorum, the teachings of the apostles, from 250 roughly, it talks about a Christmas celebration. And that's 250, so that would be a fairly early date. Some say that the first Christmas celebration that can be documented was in 336, and of all things it took place in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. Those are all kind of speculations, because it's true that in the ancient world not as much attention was paid to one's birthday as to other kinds of days in one's life or in the church year when the church was established. So we had certain kinds of days that remembered saints, remembered people from the early church, but not necessarily on their birthday. So the whole idea of remembering a birthday does not take place, at least in the first century. Perhaps in the 250s, by then there's some indication that there was an actual attempt to remember when Jesus' birthday was. And 336 is the first time that we actually have documentation that there was a celebration in Bethlehem itself. In, of all things, the place which we call today the Church of the Nativity. And the story there was that Constantine's mother, Helena, was sent by him to go to find the places that still existed from the time of Jesus. And this would have been in the mid-300s. So she goes, and theoretically she finds the place of the true cross and finds a piece of it. And ever since, there were stories about somebody had a piece of the true cross in somebody's church down through the centuries. But she also found the place where the Church of the Nativity came to be established. And all of those kind of remembrances that took place from that time go back to Constantine's mother. Some of the differences between the celebrations on the 7th and the 25th. Those churches would still follow the Julian calendar are today the church in Jerusalem, Russian Orthodox Church, Serbian Orthodox, Georgian Orthodox, Polish Orthodox, not Catholic, this is Orthodox, not Roman Catholic, and Macedonia. They still follow the January 7th day for Christmas. And so if you happen to live in let's say, Warsaw, and over here are some Orthodox people, and over here are some Roman Catholic people, well, they're going to celebrate it on different days, just as happens sometimes in the United States, depending on which Orthodox group we're talking about. And then the Gregorian calendar, which establishes it from December 25th, follows a model started in 1923 that includes the church in Constantinople, in Greece, in Cyprus, Romania, Alexandria, Antioch, Albania, Bulgaria, Ukraine, and the US. But that's not all in the US, but some, most of them. And I have a picture there of why I think it happened. That a lot of them turned to December 25th is because in Greece, who's going to come on January 6th from America? When they flock to Greece, tourists flock, well, a good time for them to flock would be during their Christmas break. And their Christmas break in the United States would be December 25th. So the Greeks say we've got to have Christmas at the same time, and therefore why not have it when the Westerners have Christmas? That's my theory. But in any case, there's a picture to prove it with the Parthenon and Santa and his sleigh riding on the 25th. And why Bethlehem, of all places? There's a picture on the left there of the star of the Nativity. So there are 14 points on that star. There's a hole going down theoretically into the cave where the Nativity is to have taken place. Some of the reasons include Matthew and Luke tells us that it happened in Bethlehem. Mark and John do not. In 145, 238, and 326, there are references to the birth of Jesus taking place in Bethlehem. There was a big debate that took place in the 1990s between an Arab Christian by the name of Oshiri, and he was debating Jerome Murphy O'Connor, who was a Dominican Roman Catholic, and he was probably one of the major spokespersons for New Testament theology living in Palestine, living specifically in the suburb of Jerusalem. And O'Connor insisted that it was Bethlehem of Judea. The alternative would have been Bethlehem of Galilee. And there is a Bethlehem of Galilee. It's not as important, not as well known. It's an existing village. And so the argument was, why wouldn't it have made sense for them to have gone from where they were living in Nazareth to Bethlehem of Galilee, where they were living, than to go all the way down into Judea? It's an interesting argument, but Jerome Murphy O'Connor's argument wins the day, and most scholars believe that it made sense to incorporate the Bethlehem of Jesus in Judea. The Davidic heritage of Jesus is important for Bethlehem, and the famous, I think Charles Schulz does this in a Peanuts cartoon, where the guy in Peanuts,
Charlie Brown.
Charlie, is saying, "But thou, Bethlehem, Ephratah," Ephratah being the old word for Bethlehem, the old name for Bethlehem. It's an odd word which crops up now and again in the New Testament. It means fruitful in Hebrew, and Jesus once says to a man who is deaf, "Be opened, Ephratah." What has that to do with Bethlehem? I don't know, other than the word can also mean be fruitful, be alive. Those are pictures of Bethlehem that are interesting to me and tend to say something about the things that are misunderstood about Bethlehem. On the right side, you see the walls of Bethlehem. Well, many people say, well, this is a tropical city and it would never have snowed in Bethlehem. But we were there when it snowed, and many people can be there when it snowed, because Bethlehem, like Jerusalem, is high. And on a cold day, it can be snowing in Jerusalem, it can snow in Bethlehem. So Jesus could have been born on a snowy day. I just think that's something many people don't realize. They think this is the tropics, it's not going to be any snow there. Another thing that's interesting to me, if you look at that picture of the man stooping through that doorway, you can tell above him was the original archway for that. So it's almost kind of a Gothic arch. But to keep people from just riding on their horses into the Church of the Nativity, they built a much smaller, narrower door so that horses could not gallop into the Church of the Nativity. And what it has come to mean is the door of humility, so that you do not come to see where the Savior was born, other than to bend down and bow low. So it's taken on a symbolism which it originally never had, but it's nevertheless interesting. And the shepherd's field, that's of course one of the big issues as to when Jesus was born. Shepherds are typically with their sheep in the springtime. And there's a gathering of sheep in the spring. But the reason for us putting it on December 25th has nothing to do with shepherds in springtime. We've sort of merged those two thoughts together, so that he may well have been born in the springtime. We don't really know exactly when, but in terms of the original thoughts, the time of the year is probably sometime in the winter. Thinking of the Julian calendar, Julius Caesar's calendar, which was an attempt to correct the confusion that existed at the time because of leap years and other days that created the problem of having a 365-day calendar. So the Orthodox had this thought. The Orthodox are very theological in their thinking, and so I find this interesting that the first of creation, the first month had to be in January, didn't it? And what would have been the 6th day of the first month when man was created? Therefore, the 6th day of the first month, January, who's the second Adam? Jesus. So that's how they got to January the 6th. All very theological, has nothing to do with history, but the Orthodox tend to be very theological in their thinking. This is a favorite picture of mine of the Magi, and also a favorite story that comes to us from T.S. Eliot. I love the picture because I once used that somewhere, and people said, well, it's pretty, but what does it mean? Well, it's mysterious, it's cryptic. The wise man is standing there looking kind of overwhelmed. The colors, the camels. I just love the symbolism of it. And I think T.S. Eliot puts that in perspective in this grand poem of his. It's probably too small for you to read it, so I'll read it to you. The first part of it at least. All this was a long time ago. I remember, and I would do it again, but sit down. This set down, this. Were we led all that way for birth or death? There was a birth, certainly. We had evidence, and no doubt. I had seen birth and death, but had thought they were different. This birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our death. We returned to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation. With an alien people clutching their gods, I should be glad of another death. Terribly profound, but very Christian, and what the Orthodox make of the wise men's visit and the meaning of it for them, as one looks at how life must be different as a result of that first birth, how we must be different, how we must die to certain things and be born to new things as a result of that first birth. I think it puts it in context for us in an interesting kind of a way. There were a lot of different emphases in Europe. The Germans, for example, had the festival of the Yule log. So there were many different celebrations that had nothing to do with Christianity. And so there were reasons why, when Christians gradually developed, they might choose to emphasize a day which pagans had remembered for various reasons, and instead remember something Christian on that day. I can understand that concept. In Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodox, today is the Theophany. And I borrowed this icon from St. Constantine and St. Helen. You can pass it around. Typically, it would sit up at the front. As people came down the aisle, they could kiss the icon. It's difficult for Westerners to understand what it means to appreciate what stands behind the icon. It's not the icon itself, but the theophany is, theos is the Greek for God, and phanein is to reveal. So the 6th of January is the day that reveals God to us. How is that done? Well, you can see it perhaps better on the picture, because in Orthodoxy, the icons are typically always reproduced in the same way. So an Epiphany icon, which is what I asked for, and the priest said, no, you want a theophany icon, which is their word for it, means the same thing, to show God. So here you see John the Baptist baptizing Jesus. But John the Baptist is not really looking at Jesus. He is looking at the divine descent from the God the Father through God the Spirit. There's a dove here, to God the Son. So this is the revelation of the Trinity. This is the revelation of the Godhead, is what the day means for the Orthodox. Over here, the angels with their halos around their heads are waiting to give clothes to Jesus, who is baptized nude. In our more Western tradition, nudity is offensive, and so he's at least partially clothed, but he represents the new Adam, the new creation. And what is baptized for the Orthodox, and we often have this question in the West, why was it necessary for Jesus to be baptized when he was perfect, divine? The Orthodox would say what was being baptized was the creation. The entire creation is being baptized, therefore he is not immersed in the water, but he is representing the baptism of the entire creation, which is in Jesus being made new. Ever so gradually, the West, which had already begun, and when I say West, so in 1054 the church split between the West, Rome, the Pope, East, Orthodox, the Patriarch, and has been split until the present day. But ever so gradually, the West, which began to celebrate Christmas before on the 25th, and the 25th and the 6th are the same in this sense, that there's 13 days difference between them. So the 12 days of Christmas, 12th night, which was last night. Shakespeare wrote a play called Twelfth Night. So that distance between them is remembered in many different kinds of ways. Those who have clergy backgrounds may well remember that during Twelfth Night, you at least could escape from all of the burdens that you had, which were joys also, but burdens certainly from the beginning of Advent all the way through the celebrations and the services of Advent and Christmas. And if you were the only pastor in the congregation, you ended up with a hoarse throat and you couldn't speak anymore. But then you had 12 days in which to celebrate the Christmas, which by then everybody had thrown out of the department stores and up in their trees and everything was gone. But many people continue to keep them not only until Epiphany, but sometimes even until Candlemas. The West continued to encourage the East to remember the birth of Christ in a way that they had never really done. They had instead focused on the baptism of all creation. And ever so gradually, the East came to celebrate Christmas, but typically on the 6th, and now sometimes also on the 25th. As long as we're talking about icons, we ought to see how real that is for us as Lutherans. Because in the Orthodox Church, there was this great battle that took place in the 8th century, somewhere between 725 and 750 and 825. Should there be pictures of holy things? Absolutely not, some said. Others said, absolutely, why not? And so there was this battle which continued until finally it was resolved in favor of their having pictures. The words are all the same. In Greek, icon is an image, imago, and imago in Latin is a picture. So it's all the same word. And so in the Orthodox Church, they continued to have pictures, lavishing. If you've ever been in St. Sava's church here in Milwaukee for a concert or something, it's just icons from floor to ceiling, absolutely glorious. But finally in 1993, the Lutherans and the Orthodox came together and they said, the more frequently Christ, Mary, the Mother of God, and the saints are seen, the more are those who see them drawn to remember and long for those who serve as models, and to pay these icons the tribute of salutation and respectful veneration. Well, it sounds very orthodox, but now let's go back to Wittenberg. In 1543, so 2 years before Luther died, Lucas Cranach, the town painter and the town printer, had painted this altarpiece in St. Mary's Church in Wittenberg. And if there was anything that was an icon, a Lutheran icon, that was. So in that Lutheran icon, you had, on the one hand, what baptism was all about in Lutheranism, what the Lord's Supper was all about in Lutheranism, what the office of the keys was all about in Lutheranism, and Luther preaching from the pulpit what the gospel was all about in Jesus Christ. And Luther himself wrote many things about this Lutheran icon, which some have even recreated. I know of one that's been recreated in a church bishop's office to help symbolize visually what the Lutheran Church is all about. Well, that's worth a whole topic in itself, to explore that icon and how it came to mean what Lutherans believe. But it sets over, and the reason this was done, you may remember parts of this story, Luther at the time had been sent to the Wartburg to hide from the emperor who said he could be executed. And he used that time to translate the New Testament into Greek. But then he heard while he was there that his colleague at the University of Wittenberg, Andreas Karlstadt, was preaching to get rid of all the pictures and all the icons in the church. Get rid of them, because what we need to have is purity, know the purity of the word. Luther came out of hiding and he preached 7 sermons. And one of them said, "How dare you tear down? What is your faith?" So it was a powerful kind of a series of sermons. They're worth reading today because they show how important pictures were to Luther, just as, so it puts us in league with the Orthodox in a very special way, how important that was. Some of the customs which continue to be celebrated today in the Orthodox community, one is the Holy Cross, and remember what I said, that in baptism Jesus baptizes the world, recreates, sanctifies the world. That's what in Orthodoxy his baptism is about. And so when they throw the cross into the water, and then all the young men dive into the water to see who can get the cross and bring it back to the bishop, who then takes the water that's on the cross and sprinkles holy water on people. That's the custom that you see happening there. On the bottom you see Warsaw, where the Orthodox are gathering as the 3 kings or the 3 sages in the foreground there in their costumes. On the right side you see the Ethiopians, who are gathered, the 3 wise men. And some of the traditions which continue in the West as well as in the East. We lived in Austin, Texas for years and always heard about the King's Cake. Never ever heard about Roscon de Reyes, which we have here today, which you may have eaten some of before, but we'll pass it around again. Roscon de Reyes is the cake of the kings, and it was a Spanish celebration. The one in the picture is the Mardi Gras one, and what you see on there are the little babies that are buried inside the cake, and if you get one, then one story is that you're responsible for cooking or baking the cake next year and throwing the party, but it can have other kinds of meanings. The beads, of course, are Mardi Gras beads, but they also symbolize royalty. On the bottom, you see Bafana. Bafana is a witch, but the story was, it happens in Italy. So Italy is Roman Catholic, but nevertheless on Epiphany, this is what they do, different from our Santa Claus. So Bafana is sort of the Italian Santa Claus, where she was an old witchy woman that was standing by the side of the road, and when the wise men came through, people gave all kinds of gifts to them that they should take to the Christ child. But she said, "Nothing doing, I don't want anything to do with that." And then the wise men were gone, and it was too late, and she had second thoughts, and she thought, "Oh, I should have done that." So she got in her broom and she flew all over the place with gifts and went to children's homes and gave gifts so that they would have some gifts, just like the Christ child got gifts. And so Befana is today the Italian Santa Claus. And you look for her on trees and ornaments and things like that. But it's just interesting how that continued in Western Christendom, not just in Orthodoxy. And then you see Angela Merkel, probably the world's most famous Lutheran, who is gathered there with all the children who on Drei Königstag, Three Kings Day, today, is celebrating with them.
German Chancellor.
She was the German Chancellor, right? And so was Schultz, but times change. This is what I told you about at the beginning. Here is a door, and the priest has come by, and this is called Chalk Day, and he comes by with his chalk. This was last year, so 2 years by now, 2023, and he wrote C and B. So Casam Mansionem Benedictam, Benedicat. And there, just to suggest again the idea of wise men, these are three kids who are dressed up like the three sages, but it's snowing like crazy. And it sure could have been in Bethlehem, because Bethlehem does have snow. So there's a Roscon de Reyes, but there's a giant one. So in Spanish-speaking countries, here you see one in Madrid that covered 10 tables, and it was vast, so everybody could have some. But that's a custom which we've tried to recreate today with our Roscon. And if you were to go to St. Constantine and St. Helen today, they would say Kale Theophanea. Theophania. The accent is on the A, Theophania. Blessed Epiphany, or Blessed Theophany. We'll pass this around so you can have some more of the king's cake or take it with you. But I did want to light, as we're doing that, this very special candle, because you did see the picture going back a ways. I'll go back to show you where that was. So at that particular spot, when you go through this door at the Church of the Nativity, where as a humble person you huddle underneath, then you go down the steps, and in that steps takes you to the bottom, and at the bottom is this 14-pointed cross, and you are supposed to kiss the silver cross, and then you can look into the hole beneath it, and you can also get a candle that you light for the first time. So this candle was lit for the first time in Bethlehem, just lit and then blown out. But we light it again on Epiphany as a symbol of our celebration of Epiphany.
Why are there 14 points to the star?
I wish I knew.
Oh.
I don't. Anybody know?
It's something to do with like genealogy. Like if you read Matthew 1, there's like 14 generations listed between Adam and King David, and then like another 14 generations maybe between David. I can't remember the exact, like there was like 3 sets of like 14 generations that were of significance.
All right.
Or something of that sort.
Something to do with 14 generations. Anybody have another theory? That was a good one. I don't know. I don't know any other.
That works.
Yeah, that was like, I referenced going to that a few weeks back in a sermon, and so I looked up why there were 14-point stars. There was a 14-point star, but it didn't make it to the final sermon, so.
The church that it's in, the Church of the Nativity, was theoretically founded by Constantine's mother, who went back to try to identify the places where Christ had been born, had lived, and so forth. That church was destroyed. Justinian rebuilt a church there. Parts of that church can still be seen. So the original pillars of the church still exist. The mosaic floor still exists. So that's quite stunning to see. And then next to it, the Roman Catholics have built a church of their own, because this is an Orthodox church, the Church of the Nativity. But the Roman Catholic one is next to it. And if you go down the street, there's the Lutheran church. That was built in the 19th century by a German Kaiser who also built one in Jerusalem. Any thoughts, questions, remarks?
Yeah, around here, a lot of churches burn the Christmas trees on Epiphany, and they use the ashes for Ash Wednesday. And I'm wondering if that has some historical precedence. They always identify the Christmas tree more with the Germanic.
I'll tell you first of all the story of a stupid young pastor who was impressed by this tradition, which seemed to be taking over in the church, that on Ash Wednesday we would anoint people like the Roman Catholics did with the sign of the cross. So I thought, oh, I could do that. And so without explaining to anybody what this was all about or why we were doing this, I went to my fireplace and I got some ashes and I put them in a pot, and I just started anointing people with the sign of the cross and realized no mark stayed. Because there are ashes and there are ashes. And the ashes of the palm leaves, for example, give you a different ash than the ashes that I was burning from my, whatever they were, probably not oak, but cheap wood that I used in the fireplace. And so I had to think about that. So everybody got a non-cross that season. Yes.
You often get a different smell too when you're burning palms. I'm going to just note that. What weight should we give to the Western overlay of the Christmas season of sometimes using days as years? So in other words, Jesus is revealed also in Jerusalem when he's 12 years old, the lesson for the gospel we heard last week. 12 years old, and the Holy Innocents is a celebration in the church. You know, a couple days, 3 days, you know, from Matthew's gospel, all the children 2 years and under are killed. So when do those traditions get hold? I mean, they are in our calendar.
Well, or maybe ask you another way, is there a point at which we decide that this date has some historical validity and that this date has some symbolic meaning that it's worth keeping, but not necessarily a historical validity? Anybody have any thoughts on that? Because the actual truth of a date, a given date, I think it's interesting as a historian myself. I find it interesting to go back and see how far back can we really go historically and say the Christians were celebrating the date that they somehow identified with the day that Jesus was born on. And you can come up with all kinds of reasons why they did that. But whether they got the actual date right or not, number one, you can't know. Number two, does it make any difference? That's my thought. But, Carl?
The liturgical calendar in July celebrates the Annunciation 9 months before the 25th.
Yes. So the conception of Jesus was exactly 9 months later. The birth was 9 months later, the 25th, and the conception was the 25th of March.
Right.
Zoop!
Right. And the birth of John the Baptist in June.
Yeah.
For the same
But
reason,
I
6 months older.
I think it's valid to say that the church found it meaningful to try to identify places in their church life that related to the life of people, Godhead, that was important to them. And they didn't really care so much about whether this was, if you would have asked 20 Christians in Jerusalem at that time, what date were you born on? Most wouldn't be able to tell you, because they did not count that as an important issue in their life.
So isn't significant percentage of the whole thought here symbolic?
There's a lot of symbolism
Yeah,
involved.
I mean,
And symbolism is very important, I think. Symbolism is a segment of history that's the best we have to go on when you can't actually prove something historically.
well, we can't prove exactly when, but we can know it was historic somehow. But we do know something about Easter anyway.
Yeah, for unusual reason, right?
Mhm.
Any other thoughts about Christmas, Epiphany, Theophany?
No, it's,
Thought you catch the lady in the back.
it's, I appreciated the scent of the incense when I walked into the church today, but I missed the beginning of the presentation. In memory, going to a midnight mass at a Catholic church or midnight mass in Episcopal church, I always really enjoyed that incense. It really gave a holy, sort of a, that sacrifice or praise or something like that. When did the Lutheran Church get away, did the Lutheran Church ever use
It's
incense?
probably worth a study, you know? I mean, I think so many different changes took place through Martin Luther. The fact is that Martin Luther was a fairly conservative reformer. There were some things that he did, some reforms that he carried out, which were fairly radical. But there were many things which he kept. So when it comes to the meaning of baptism and the meaning of the Lord's Supper, while Luther did make some changes in terms of the theological meaning, he stayed pretty close to the original, as opposed to the Reformed. I was thinking about that with respect to symbols and icons. One time I was teaching in Pretoria, South Africa, and I took the opportunity to go to a Reformed church because you know that a lot of Dutch people settled in South Africa. And so Afrikaans, one of the languages of South Africa, comes from the Netherlands. So there was this huge Reformed church, and I thought I'm going to go inside just to kind of look at it, see what it looks like. Well, it was absolutely enormous, and it was enormous by virtue of it being so toweringly huge. Not one symbol, one picture, one symbol of any kind in the entire thing, except the Bible sitting on the pulpit. That was their symbol. And then there was a baptismal font, and there was an altar table, but there was no symbol of any kind, because Calvin had said, the great the great Swiss reformer, that those kind of symbols are not important. Only the Word of God is important.
We haven't talked much about illiterate and literacy, and people were predominantly illiterate until recently, and they were surrounded by the Bible with pictures when they went to worship. So wasn't that also a form of telling the story?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this quote from Luther, who said, in reference to that, because you had so many people who had no education of any kind,
Right.
and he said, if it were up to me, I would paint the exterior of all the houses with biblical stories.
Right.
I think it's a remarkable kind of a thought, because it says Luther was an icon maker. He really wanted to carry out the visualization of the scripture. Yes, sir?
Going back to incense for a sec, I've been at Lutheran churches that have used incense, so I'd say it's probably more of a just churches not being in the practice of it, then like there isn't any like theological or like, you know, institutional edict not to use it. I just don't think we have a thurible which is the little like incense on a chain device to use. But yeah, I'd say there's no rule
Right,
against it.
it's not heresy. Did I say this is borrowed from Trinity Episcopal, the thurible from today? So it's a way of visualizing or using our senses to try to appreciate something about our Christian heritage that we can't get just with our eyes.
Mhm.
So with our nose, we can.
Well, yeah, there's with our eyes too, and that we see the smoke ascending upwards and kind of just like dissipating into the air. And you know, we have the tradition of like chant, let my prayers rise like incense. So there's this sense of kind of an upward movement to heaven with the incense.
Yeah, and there are certainly European churches. I mean, if you followed the direction of the Reformation, so Luther said when it came to, well, for example, the apostolic succession, he said it wasn't important to him. What was important was that the gospel was retained in its purity. But then when it came to, let's say, the ecclesiastical vestments and a lot of the other things like incense and which were retained by, let's say, the Church of Sweden and the Church of Finland, somehow in America it could have been, here we were on the plains with a little white wood church and trying to gather together on a Sunday morning, the pioneers in our little village, but incense maybe didn't fit anymore. And that's it.
I don't mean to take us too far afield with this, but some of the, one of the legacies of the Reformation was a lot of name calling on both sides. Luther was creative with his ways of putting people down, for instance, and one of the the ecumenical movement's a long conversation, but I think one significant moment of thawing was Vatican II, which among other things we see the shift of the Roman Catholic Church to stop having worship done in Latin, but instead done in the vernacular. And there were other liturgical reforms that were kind of like that there was a kind of there was a lot of reciprocity done from Lutheran liturgical theologians to try and that have shortened the distance between Roman liturgical practice and Lutheran liturgical practice, which is what I would imagine in practice has resulted in a not insignificant number of Lutheran congregations in the United States. In my experience, often in the Northeast or along the Atlantic seaboard, more than the Midwest, returning to things such as use of incense, or even more so, like having communion weekly as opposed to once a month or twice a month, things of that sort.
I was just reacting to the smell or the five senses. The incarnation of Jesus, I think in the Epiphany season is related to the five senses, that now we have a person that we can relate to with the five human senses. And, I mean, we have the baptism as water, the feel, smell, taste, the wedding at Cana, water into wine is a classic Epiphany story relating to taste. And I think the five senses are featured prominently in a lot of our observation of the season of Epiphany, because it relates to the incarnation story of Jesus.
Yeah, and it's interesting to try to understand why some religious groups did away with any kind of use of the senses. So the Quakers, for example, have their own spiritual baptism, but don't use water. Just use air. No, they use spirituality as a way of touching a person. And there are reasons why some denominations have gone away from that, but it's kind of interesting.
I had the opportunity not too long ago to do a baptism with a Greek Orthodox priest. We had a neighbor who would come to me and said, "Carl, would you baptize my children?" And I said, "Aren't you Orthodox?" He's from Lebanon. He said, "Oh yes, I'm Orthodox, but we have Christians in Lebanon as well as you Orthodox." He was having a confusion with American Christians. But anyway, I said, "If you find an Orthodox priest," so we did a baptism together in his yard. And what I loved with the Orthodox priest, I got to do the anointing. And the Orthodox priest explained it to me, and I did it with my own grandchildren, that when you anoint the five senses. You anoint the ears so you can hear the word of God's love through your neighbor. Or you can see the presence, the theophany of God with your new eyes of baptism. And then you anoint the mouth, and then the mind and the heart. It's a powerful liturgy. It goes on for an hour. The Greek Orthodox, and then you're casting out evil.
Carl, you were reminding me that there's stained glass in the cathedrals that tell the story of the Bible when most people were illiterate. And it makes me think that in some way, perhaps incense does the same thing, because we all know that smell is like right next to the part of your brain that controls memory, right? So like when you smell something your mom used to cook, you know, you remember that.
Yeah.
But that incense could be a signal to your brain to worship, right? Like if you always smell that smell when you walk in to church, it would prepare your mind and your body to worship. And the frankincense smell is the smell that's in the oil that we anoint babies with at baptism. So they smell so sweet with frankincense.
Hey, you talked about the Magi, and I've seen a program where they believe that the Magi are what we would today call astrophysicists, that they were Persian and they studied the heavens very, very much, and that the idea goes back to Babylon, even though it's not written in Daniel, that the birth of the Savior would be foretold, and that they had heard these foretellings centuries, you know, and when they saw this star, they said, "This must be it." And as it sets, they follow it because they have to keep it in vision. So they follow this and they think, well, this must be what was foretold, that this is this king who's coming, and we must go and see.
Okay, there's a lot of interesting speculation about who these people were, and we'll never know, but that's one. Yes, ma'am.
He'd been trying to say something for.
Well, he has to wave his hand.
I got shoulder problems. So the church, back to the church in South Africa, did they have a cross in the church other than the Bible?
Yeah, that's a good question. Trying to remember. I can't actually remember. So I can't answer that, but I think there are more extreme versions of, so if you follow that along, so Reformed churches and the modern exponent of that in America, Presbyterian churches. If you go into a Presbyterian church today, it could look fairly Episcopal in some settings. So we've become a little bit different than the original Reformed. I think South Africa is pretty straight from right out of the Netherlands. But I don't know the answer to that.
I think yes, but certainly not an ornately decorated one. It would be a pretty plain one. Or another point of reference would be kind of the colonial puritanical, churches in New England that that are now would be part of the UCC. So like white walls, as opposed no stained glass, things of that sort.
Okay, thank you so much for coming today. There's a lot of Roscon de Reyes up here. If you'd like to take some with you, grab a napkin and a piece of Kleenex over there. Empty the plate.